The call came at 4:47 in the morning, not from the front, not from a field commander reporting enemy contact, from the war cabinet itself, from the men in the deepest room of the Curia who had been watching the Northern Front's command picture dissolve in real time for the previous 90 minutes, and who had now arrived at a conclusion that no Israeli prime minister had ever been required to reach in the modern history of the state. The conclusion that the military situation had deteriorated past the threshold at which continued fighting was strategically rational. Israel called for a ceasefire, not from a position of negotiating strength, not as a tactical pause designed to reconstitute and re-engage, as a genuine acknowledgement that the instrument of Israeli military power in the north had been broken, that the 5 brigades of the IDF's Northern Command that had constituted the ground force architecture designed to hold the Lebanese border and project force into Hezbollah-controlled territory, had ceased to exist as functional combat formations, and that the capability required to reverse that situation was not available within any operationally relevant timeline. What destroyed them was 300 Khaibar-Shekan ballistic missiles fired in coordinated waves from dispersed mobile platforms across western Iran and positions inside Syria, arriving over the Galilee and the Jezreel Valley in 3 precisely timed salvos across a 92-minute window that was specifically designed to solve a specific operational problem, which was how to eliminate 5 dispersed brigade-level formations, their command infrastructure, their logistics networks, and their air defense coverage, simultaneously and permanently, before a single surviving element could be reconstituted into a coherent defensive posture. The Khaibar-Shekan did not miss. The command posts went first, then the artillery concentrations, then the armored staging areas, then the logistics hubs and fuel points and ammunition depots that give a forward-deployed ground force its operational endurance, then the radar sites and air defense batteries that were supposed to protect all of it. By the time the 3rd salvo completed its attack runs and the silence returned to the northern Galilee, what had been the IDF's primary ground force architecture in the north was burning across 40 kilometers of Israeli territory, and the command centers in Tel Aviv were receiving damage assessments so catastrophic that senior officers initially refused to transmit them through standard channels. This is not a setback. This is not a temporary operational reversal that more resources and a revised plan can address. This is the destruction of the Israeli army's northern ground force and the political capitulation that follows from it. And the world that exists after this morning is not the world that existed before it. Tonight, we are going to tell you exactly how Iran executed this operation, what the Khaibar-Shekan actually is, and what it can do that Western intelligence spent years insisting was beyond Iranian capability, why 5 IDF brigades with trophy-equipped armor and layered air defense coverage were destroyed in 92 minutes, what a ceasefire called under these conditions actually means for Israeli deterrence, and what the collapse of the Northern Front signals for the broader strategic balance in a region that has been changing faster than any official narrative has been willing to acknowledge. Stay with us. Every part of this story matters. If you are watching this channel for the first time, understand what we do here. We do not read headlines back to you. We do not summarize what the wire services have already reported. We go into the weapons, the doctrine, the operational architecture, the geopolitical consequences, and we give you the analysis that the governments in Tel Aviv and Washington are currently hoping you never encounter in this much detail. If that is the channel you came here for, subscribe now, hit like, and turn on notifications. Because what is happening in the north of Israel right now is not finished. The ceasefire is a chapter break, not an ending. And you need to be here for every development as it unfolds. Drop your assessment in the comments. This community thinks seriously about these questions, and tonight there is a great deal to think about seriously. 4 questions. The 4 questions that every surviving IDF brigade commander, every Pentagon rapid assessment team, and every defense ministry from London to Seoul is trying to answer right now, and that the mainstream coverage does not have the technical depth to address. First, the IDF's Northern Command operated behind a layered air defense architecture that included Iron Dome batteries, David Sling installations, and Arrow 3 coverage for the outer envelope. That architecture was specifically built and specifically upgraded to handle exactly the kind of ballistic missile threat that Iran fired tonight. It failed. Not partially, not at the margins. Comprehensively. Was this a saturation failure, a guidance penetration failure, a coordination breakdown in the engagement sequence, or has Iran specifically engineered the Khaibar-Shekan's flight profile to exploit the seams between overlapping defensive layers in a way that Western intelligence had not attributed to Iranian ballistic missile doctrine? Second, 5 IDF brigades were destroyed in 92 minutes. Brigade-level formations are not simple targets. They are dispersed, they are hardened at key nodes, they have organic air defense assets, and their command structures are specifically designed with redundancy to maintain function under fire. Destroying 5 of them simultaneously, comprehensively, within the engagement window of a single ballistic missile salvo sequence, requires targeting intelligence of a quality and currency that implies penetration of Israeli operational security at a level that nobody in the defense establishment is currently ready to discuss publicly. Where did that targeting data come from? And what does its existence tell us about the depth of Iranian intelligence preparation for this operation? Third, the Khaibar-Shekan was publicly assessed by Western defense analysts as a capable medium-range ballistic missile with meaningful improvements over the Fateh 110 family from which it derives. Its accuracy against dispersed, mobile, partially concealed brigade-level targets across a 40-kilometer engagement zone goes significantly beyond what those public assessments attributed to the system. Either the assessments were wrong, which is itself a major intelligence failure, or the system that flew tonight incorporated guidance improvements that were not previously attributed to the Khaibar-Shekan program. Which is it? And what does the answer tell us about the reliability of the public picture of Iranian missile capability? And fourth, Israel has called for a ceasefire. Ceasefires called from positions of military defeat carry political and strategic consequences that extend far beyond the immediate cessation of hostilities. They signal to every actor in the region, to every Hezbollah commander, to every Iranian strategic planner, to every Gulf state capital that is recalibrating its alignment posture, that the military instrument which has underwritten Israeli deterrence for 70 years has been broken in the north. What does deterrence look like for a state whose primary ground force has been destroyed and whose ceasefire request has been answered, if it is answered, from a position of complete Iranian strategic advantage? Let us get into it. To understand what happened to the IDF's Northern Command in 92 minutes, you need to understand the specific operational problem that Iran was solving, because the strike architecture was not designed simply to destroy military assets. It was designed to solve a sequencing problem, which was how to destroy 5 brigade-level formations simultaneously when those formations are dispersed across 40 kilometers of terrain, with overlapping organic and theater air defense coverage, without giving any surviving element sufficient warning to disperse further or to reconstitute a defensive posture before the next salvo arrived. Iran solved that problem with a strike architecture built around 3 principles: simultaneity, sequencing, and the deliberate exploitation of the reconstitution gap. The first salvo of approximately 90 Khaibar-Shekan missiles launched from dispersed mobile platforms in western Iran and from fixed positions inside Syrian territory that Iranian forces had been quietly hardening for the previous 18 months. These 90 missiles did not target brigade combat elements. They targeted the command and control infrastructure, the Northern Command headquarters at Safed, the forward brigade command posts in the Galilee Highlands, the communications nodes, the digital battle management systems, the radar arrays that provide the targeting picture for organic air defense, the artillery fire direction centers, everything that makes 5 dispersed brigades function as a coordinated fighting force rather than 5 separate collections of vehicles and personnel. By the time the first salvo impacts were complete, the Northern Command was not merely damaged, it was operationally blind. Brigade commanders could not reach Northern Command headquarters. Artillery units could not receive fire missions. Air defense systems operating without centralized coordination defaulted to local engagement protocols that had not been designed for a 3-salvo ballistic missile environment. The force was still physically present in its positions, but its nervous system had been severed. The second salvo arrived 11 minutes after the first. 11 minutes is not an accident. It is a calculated interval. 11 minutes is approximately the time required for surviving personnel at struck command posts to reach backup communications equipment, assess the situation, and begin transmitting emergency reports up the chain. 11 minutes is also slightly less than the time required for Iron Dome battery crews that had expended interceptors against the first salvo to complete a full reload cycle and restore their engagement capacity. The second salvo arrived precisely at the maximum point of organizational disorientation and minimum point of defensive readiness. The second salvo targeted the ground combat elements themselves, the armored battalions of the 5 brigades concentrated in staging areas that Iranian targeting intelligence had mapped with a precision that implies months of continuous surveillance. Trophy systems on surviving Merkava tanks attempted to engage drones that preceded the second salvo as decoy and saturation vehicles, depleting active protection capacity in the 60 seconds before ballistic warheads arrived. The combination of depleted active protection, severed command coordination, and simultaneous engagement from multiple azimuths produced a ground combat result that mirrors in structure, though exceeded in scale, what Iranian swarm doctrine achieved against the Southern Armored Division in previous engagements. The third salvo, arriving 41 minutes after the second, was the logistics and sustainment strike. Fuel dumps, ammunition depots, the mobile maintenance facilities and recovery vehicles that allow a forward-deployed ground force to repair battle damage and sustain movement. Medical collection points. The forward supply convoys that had been moving north along Route 85 and Route 90 since before dawn, caught in the open by targeting intelligence that tracked Israeli military vehicle movements through a combination of satellite imagery, signals intercepts, and sources that IDF counterintelligence is currently working to identify. After the third salvo, the 5 brigades of the Northern Command were not suppressed. They were not temporarily disrupted. They were destroyed as functional military organizations, their commands severed, their combat elements degraded past the threshold of offensive or defensive utility, their logistics consumed by secondary explosions that burned for hours across the Galilee hillsides. And the damage assessments that began reaching the War Cabinet in Tel Aviv shortly after 6 in the morning produced the conversation that ended with the ceasefire call. The Khaibar-Shekan was publicly introduced by Iran in February of 2022 at a ceremony that Western defense analysts described in assessments ranging from cautiously attentive to actively dismissive. The name itself was chosen with deliberate symbolic weight. Khaibar-Shekan translates approximately as the Breaker of Khaibar, a reference to a 7th century Islamic battle, chosen specifically to communicate the missile's intended target audience. The choice of name was noted, catalogued, and then largely set aside in the publicly available analysis, which focused on the missile's assessed range of approximately 1,400 kilometers and its heritage relationship to the Fateh 110 solid-fuel missile family. What those assessments missed, or what they acknowledged in classified form but could not incorporate into the public picture, was the degree to which the Khaibar-Shekan represents not an incremental upgrade to an existing platform, but a qualitative step change in Iranian ballistic missile terminal guidance capability. The Khaibar-Shekan uses a solid fuel propulsion system that allows for rapid launch preparation, critically reducing the window during which mobile launchers are detectable and targetable by Israeli or American surveillance assets. From the decision to fire to the missile leaving the rail, the preparation window is measured in minutes, not hours. This means that the kind of pre-launch warning that intelligence services rely upon to generate tactical warning for defensive systems is structurally compressed to the point of operational irrelevance. The guidance architecture is where the system diverges most significantly from previous Iranian medium-range ballistic missile designs. The terminal guidance package combines an inertial navigation system, which provides basic trajectory management through the initial and mid-course phases, with a terminal active radar seeker that activates in the final phase of flight and provides target discrimination and aim point refinement against the actual physical signature of the target rather than against preloaded coordinate data alone. This combination, inertial mid-course with active terminal homing, is the same guidance philosophy that makes the American ATACMS and the Russian Iskander accurate against mobile and semi-mobile targets. The practical consequence of this guidance architecture is a circular error probable against dispersed mobile military targets that Western public assessments had not attributed to Iranian ballistic missile systems. against the command posts, vehicle concentrations, and radar arrays that constituted the Northern Command's physical infrastructure, the Khaibar-Shekan's terminal seeker does not need to know exactly where a command post vehicle is parked to the meter. It needs to know approximately where it is, to within a few hundred meters, and then it finds the radar signature of the largest vehicle in the cluster and homes on it autonomously. This is not the same engineering problem as hitting a fixed hardened facility with a pre-surveyed coordinate. Hitting a fixed facility is a guidance challenge that Iran solved years ago. Hitting a dispersed, partially mobile, partially concealed military formation across 40 kilometers of varied terrain is a fundamentally different problem, one that requires the seeker-equipped terminal guidance that the Khaibar-Shekan carries and that previous Iranian ballistic missile designs did not. The question of how Iran got there is a question that the Western intelligence community is currently examining with some urgency and some discomfort. Three contributing factors seem most relevant. The first is indigenous development compounding over time. Iran's ballistic missile program has been running continuously for more than 2 decades, accumulating institutional knowledge, engineering capability, and manufacturing experience that compounds with each generation of development. What looks from the outside like a sudden capability leap in terminal guidance sophistication is, from the inside, the culmination of 2 decades of incremental seeker technology development that was not fully visible in the testing signature that intelligence collection was tracking. The second is the degree of technical cooperation with partners whose public posture of distance from Iranian military programs does not fully reflect the depth of the technical exchange occurring at the engineering level. The specific design philosophy of the Khaibar-Shekan's terminal guidance package bears signatures that analysts with experience in Russian and Chinese seeker development programs have noted in their assessments. Whether that reflects direct transfer, independent parallel development, or something in between is a question whose answer remains in the classified domain. But the question itself is being asked at the highest levels of the American and Israeli intelligence establishments. The third is operational testing in conditions that replicate the operational problem. Iran has conducted multiple large-scale missile strikes against Israeli territory across this conflict. Each engagement provided real-world performance data on Israeli air defense response, engagement sequencing, interceptor consumption rates, and the specific gaps in coverage that emerge under high-volume attack. The Khaibar-Shekan strike tonight was not the first time Iran has fired this system at Israeli targets. It was the first time it has been fired at this volume, in this coordination architecture, against this target set. The design of tonight's strike incorporated lessons from every previous engagement. The production scale of the Khaibar-Shekan program, finally, is itself a strategic variable whose significance should not be underestimated. 300 missiles fired in a single operation implies a stockpile substantially larger. Iran's dispersed, hardened underground production infrastructure, built specifically to survive Israeli air interdiction attempts against fixed surface facilities, continues producing at rates that Western sanctions were designed to prevent and have manifestly failed to stop. The operational consumption rate of tonight's engagement does not meaningfully deplete the strategic reserve. Iran can do this again. The IDF's Northern Command did not lack for air defense coverage. Let that be stated clearly before the analysis proceeds. The formations that were destroyed tonight were operating behind a layered defensive architecture that represented the output of decades of American-Israeli investment in exactly the missile defense problem that Iran presented tonight. Iron Dome batteries providing terminal defense against shorter-range threats. David Sling covering the medium-range ballistic missile envelope. Arrow 3 providing the outer layer against longer-range systems. And the entire architecture networked through the American-supplied integrated air defense network that is supposed to allow each layer to cue the next and to manage the engagement sequence across the full threat volume. That architecture failed tonight, and understanding why it failed requires confronting a set of structural limitations that are embedded in the physics and economics of ballistic missile defense, not in any failure of execution or technology. The core problem is arithmetic. Every air defense system has a finite magazine and a finite engagement rate. The number of interceptors it can fire simultaneously, the rate at which those interceptors can be managed by fire control, and the time required to reload after magazine exhaustion are all physical constants that operational design cannot change. When the attacking missile volume is sized and sequenced specifically to exploit those constants, specifically to arrive in volumes that exceed the simultaneous engagement capacity of the defending system during the window when magazine reload is incomplete, the defense fails not because it is poorly designed, but because the attacker has solved the arithmetic in their favor before the first missile leaves the launcher. Iran solved the arithmetic. The 90 missiles of the first salvo arrived simultaneously across multiple azimuths at a volume that saturated the terminal engagement capacity of the Iron Dome and David Sling batteries covering the Northern Command infrastructure. Not every missile was intercepted. The ones that were not hit the command posts. The second salvo arrived in the reload window, exploiting the gap between magazine exhaustion and reconstitution. The third salvo faced a defensive architecture that had been depleted across 2 previous engagement cycles and was operating without the centralized command coordination that its engagement prioritization logic requires. The seam exploitation dimension of the failure is equally important. The Arrow, David Sling, and Iron Dome systems are designed to function as an integrated layered architecture in which each layer hands off threats that it cannot engage to the next layer inward. This handoff requires communication, requires targeting data sharing, requires a command coordination function that assigns engagement authority across the layers in real time. That coordination function is provided by the command infrastructure that the first salvo specifically targeted. After the first salvo destroyed the command nodes, the 3 defensive layers did not stop functioning, but they began functioning as 3 separate independent systems rather than as an integrated architecture. Each layer attempted to engage the threats in its individual envelope without the coordinating intelligence that allows the layers to manage the overall threat volume collectively. The seams between the layers, the altitude bands and range zones, where engagement authority transitions from one system to the next, widened into operational gaps that the second and third salvos were specifically timed to exploit. The trophy failure against the ground combat elements replicates the pattern that has become a structural feature of every engagement in which autonomous kamikaze drone decoys have been used to deplete active protection capacity before ballistic warhead arrival. 30 seconds of drone engagement emptied trophy countermeasure rounds that could not be replenished before the ballistic warheads arrived from above. The physics of the engagement geometry did the rest. The deepest failure is doctrinal. Israeli air defense architecture was designed around the assumption that the volume of simultaneous ballistic missile engagement it would face in any single operational scenario was bounded by the production and logistics constraints on Iranian missile operations. That assumption was based on intelligence assessments of Iranian missile stockpile, production rate, and operational tempo that underestimated each of those variables by margins large enough to produce the arithmetic outcome that played out tonight. 300 missiles in a coordinated 3-salvo architecture is outside the design envelope of the defensive system that was supposed to stop them. Not because the individual components of that system failed to perform as designed, because the design was calibrated against a threat ceiling that Iran has now surpassed. A ceasefire called from military defeat is not a ceasefire in the traditional sense of the term. It is not a mutual agreement between parties that have fought to a mutually exhausting stalemate, and that both calculate they can achieve more through negotiation than through continued fighting. It is a political acknowledgement that the military instrument has failed, and that the political leadership has concluded that continued fighting in the current military situation will produce outcomes worse than whatever terms can be negotiated from the current position of weakness. Israel called for a ceasefire this morning because the IDF's Northern Command no longer exists as a functional ground force. Because the 5 brigades that were supposed to hold the Northern Front cannot hold anything. Because the reconstitution of those brigades to operational readiness requires equipment, personnel, and logistical rebuilding that cannot be completed in any time frame that the current operational situation permits. And because continuing to fight without a functional Northern ground force means accepting whatever follow-on operation Iran and Hezbollah choose to conduct against northern Israeli territory without the military capacity to contest it. The strategic consequences of this ceasefire extend far beyond the operational situation in the north. For Israeli deterrence, the ceasefire is a rupture in the foundational logic of Israeli security strategy. Israeli deterrence has rested for 7 decades on the proposition that the cost of attacking Israel is unacceptably high, that any adversary that initiates military action against Israeli forces will suffer consequences that outweigh any possible gain, and that the IDF's capacity to impose those consequences is reliable enough that rational adversaries will be deterred from testing them. Tonight, an adversary tested that proposition, and the proposition failed. Not at the margins, comprehensively. The ceasefire is the formal acknowledgement of that failure. Every actor in the region that has been making calculations based on Israeli deterrence as a fixed variable in the strategic equation is now making different calculations. For Hezbollah, the ceasefire creates a strategic situation it has been working toward for 15 years. The IDF's Northern Ground Force, the force designed specifically to conduct the kind of deep ground operation into Lebanon that would threaten Hezbollah's core infrastructure, has been destroyed. Hezbollah's rocket and missile arsenal, substantially intact, is aimed at a northern Israel from which the primary military counter to its use has been eliminated. The ceasefire that Israel is asking for is the ceasefire that Hezbollah has the military position to offer or withhold on its own terms. For Iran, the ceasefire validates with operational finality the strategic concept that the Khaibar-Shekan program was built to demonstrate, that the combination of precision ballistic missiles, coordinated attack architecture, and the deliberate exploitation of defensive arithmetic can break an Israeli ground force in a single engagement window. Iran spent years developing this capability, years testing components of it in operational environments, years absorbing the intelligence, the diplomatic, and the economic costs of maintaining the program under international pressure. Tonight, those years of investment produced the return that justified them. For Washington, the ceasefire creates a political and strategic crisis that no press statement is going to manage. The American security commitment to Israel has been defined in terms that the current situation directly challenges. An ally has suffered a military defeat of the first order, has called for a ceasefire from a position of military weakness, and American military assets that were present in the theater did not prevent the outcome that produced that defeat. The credibility questions this generates propagate immediately to every other security commitment, in every other theater, where allied governments are making decisions based on assessments of what the American guarantee actually means. The broader regional realignment that has been underway for years accelerates dramatically from tonight's ceasefire forward. Gulf states that have been quietly hedging their alignment postures, exploring diplomatic channels with Tehran, reducing the visibility of their military cooperation with Washington, will accelerate those adjustments in the light of a demonstration that the Israeli military instrument, the instrument that their own security posture has partly depended upon, cannot be counted on to hold against Iranian military action at this level of intensity. The options available to Israel in the aftermath of tonight's engagement and the ceasefire call are painful in every direction. Accepting the ceasefire on terms that Iran and Hezbollah dictate means accepting a strategic situation in which the northern front has been conceded without the ground force capacity to contest it, in which the deterrence signal broadcast to every regional actor is one of military defeat, followed by political capitulation, and in which the reconstruction of a viable northern military posture requires a time frame measured in months at minimum, during which the strategic situation continues to evolve in directions Israel cannot control. Rejecting the ceasefire and attempting to continue fighting with the military forces that survived tonight's engagement means committing degraded, disorganized, and logistically unsupported forces against an adversary that retains the missile inventory and the operational architecture to conduct follow-on strikes against whatever reconstitution efforts Israel attempts. The second engagement under these conditions would likely produce a worse military outcome than the first. Escalation to other domains, strikes against Iranian territory, activation of Israeli capabilities that have not yet been used in this conflict, the options that Israeli War Cabinet discussions have reportedly included, each carries consequences that compound the strategic problem rather than solving it. Striking Iranian territory from a position of demonstrated military weakness Without the Air Force capacity destroyed at Tel Nof or the Northern Ground Force destroyed tonight, risks a retaliatory response that the degraded Israeli military cannot manage. And activating options that cross new thresholds in a conflict where the American support posture has been demonstrably constrained means accepting those consequences without the alliance backstop that previous Israeli escalatory decisions assumed would be present. The American decision space is equally constrained from a different direction. Washington cannot publicly abandon an ally that has just suffered a military defeat and called for a ceasefire. The domestic political and alliance credibility consequences of that posture are prohibitive. But Washington also cannot commit the military resources and the political capital required to reverse the situation on the ground without accepting escalatory risks, resource commitments, and regional consequences that the current administration has consistently calculated are too high. The space between those two constraints is where American diplomacy will operate for the coming period, working back channels to produce a ceasefire architecture that can be presented as something other than Israeli defeat, providing emergency military assistance that can begin the reconstitution process, managing the Gulf state relationships that are drifting, and attempting to construct a political framework that acknowledges the changed military reality in the north, while preserving enough of the formal structure of Israeli security commitments to prevent the complete collapse of the regional architecture that American strategy depends upon. None of this is adequate to the strategic magnitude of what happened tonight. All of it will be attempted anyway, because the alternatives are worse. What you are watching tonight is not a military engagement. It is the operational expression of a strategic transition that has been building across 20 years of Iranian investment, American overextension, regional political realignment, and the gradual erosion of the deterrence architecture that governed the Middle East since 1967. The IDF's Northern Command was not destroyed because Israeli soldiers fought badly. It was destroyed because the weapons used against it were designed specifically to defeat the defensive architecture that protected it, sized specifically to exceed the arithmetic limits of that architecture, and employed with a doctrinal sophistication that translated technical capability into tactical outcome, with a consistency that reflects years of operational preparation, intelligence collection, and doctrinal refinement. Iran did not discover this capability last night. It built it across 2 decades of sanctions, assassinations, cyber attacks, diplomatic isolation, and sustained external pressure that was designed to prevent exactly the capability that was demonstrated tonight. That pressure failed, not because the instruments of pressure were wrongly chosen or poorly applied. It failed because the nation being pressured concluded that the development of this capability was worth any cost that external pressure could impose, and organized its national resources, its scientific talent, its military culture, and its political will around achieving it. That kind of strategic determination is not defeated by better interceptors or improved intelligence. It is a force of history that operates on timelines that conventional military planning does not accommodate. The ceasefire that Israel has requested this morning is not the end of this story. It is a chapter break in a strategic transition whose final shape has not yet become visible. What comes after it will be determined by decisions made in the coming days and weeks in Tel Aviv, in Washington, in Tehran, and in the Gulf capitals where the regional order is being reconstructed in real time. 3 questions that deserve your most serious thinking. What does Israeli security look like after tonight? In a strategic environment where the Northern Ground Force has been destroyed, the Air Force has been degraded at Tel Nof, and the ceasefire has been called for military defeat. What combination of military reconstitution, political adjustment, and diplomatic engagement can produce a viable security posture from the position that exists this morning? If Iran has now demonstrated in live combat conditions that it can destroy an Israeli brigade-level formation with ballistic missiles and force a ceasefire, what does this capability look like when applied against other adversaries in other theaters by other actors who have been studying every detail of tonight's engagement? And most fundamentally, what does this ceasefire signal to the actors across the Middle East and beyond, who have been watching the military balance shift and waiting to see whether the shift would produce political consequences of the magnitude that a military defeat of this kind historically generates. Drop your analysis below. If this breakdown gave you the depth that this moment demands, share it. Subscribe. Turn on notifications because the next phase of this is already developing, and you need to be here when it does. This is U.S. Power Analysis. Stay sharp, stay informed, and we will see you in the next one.